the legend of Daji, fox spirit, fatal beauty, and the fall of the Shang dynasty. Few figures in Chinese mythology and folklore cast as long a shadow as Daji, the woman whose name has become synonymous across millennia with dangerous beauty, seductive ruin, and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked desire. She is simultaneously a historical personage, a mythological construct, a literary villain, and a cultural symbol, layered with meanings that have shifted and deepened over more than 3,000 years of storytelling. To speak of Daji is to speak of the end of a dynasty, the wrath of a goddess, the cunning of a fox, and the fragility of civilizations built on the whims of their rulers. Her legend is not merely a tale of one woman's wickedness. It is a vast, sprawling meditation on power, gender, morality, and the always precarious relationship between heaven and the throne. The story of Daji belongs to that category of myth where history and imagination have fused so completely that separating one from the other has become, in any meaningful sense, impossible. Everything between those two poles has been elaborated, embroidered, and reimagined by countless tellers across 3,000 years, until what remains is not a woman, but an archetype, the beautiful destroyer, the fox in human form, the instrument through which heaven judges the corrupt. To engage seriously with the Daji legend is to engage with some of the deepest and most persistent questions in Chinese cultural history. How does a civilization account for the failure of its institutions? Who bears responsibility when power corrupts? What is the relationship between private virtue and public order? And why, across so many cultures and so many centuries, does the figure who answers these questions so often wear a woman's face? These are not merely academic questions. They are the questions that the legend was built to answer, and understanding how it answers them tells us something essential about the civilization that produced it. 1. The historical kernel, Daji and the fall of Shang. Before the legends accumulated their gilded and terrible weight, there was history, or at least the dim outline of it. The Shang dynasty, one of the oldest confirmed dynasties in Chinese history, ruled the Yellow River Basin for roughly 6 centuries, from approximately 1600 BCE to 1046 BCE. At its height, Shang civilization was sophisticated, with a highly developed system of bronze casting, oracle bone divination, a complex religious hierarchy, and a royal court of considerable grandeur. But by the reign of its last king, a man known to history as Di Xin, or more commonly by his posthumous title, Zhou Xin, the Tyrant King, the dynasty had rotted from within. Di Xin was, by the accounts of later historians, a ruler of prodigious natural talent who chose to squander every gift he possessed. Ancient texts describe him as physically imposing, intellectually sharp, and possessed of a certain charismatic brutality. He could reportedly break the neck of a bull with his bare hands and debate scholars with ease. But he was also arrogant, self-indulgent, and increasingly contemptuous of the ritual obligations and moral responsibilities that Chinese kingship demanded. He raised taxes to extravagant levels, conscripted laborers in vast numbers to build pleasure palaces, and surrounded himself with flatterers while dismissing or executing those who dared to counsel restraint. It was into this court that Daji arrived. The historical records, filtered as they are through centuries of Confucian moralizing and mythological embellishment, agree on certain basic facts. She was a woman from the Su clan, likely brought to the court as part of a tribute or conquest arrangement, and she became Di Xin's most favored consort. Her influence over the king was seen by those who opposed him as total and catastrophic. Whatever others suggest, she was more passive, a beautiful vessel into which a king poured his worst impulses, a convenient figure onto whom historians could deflect responsibility away from the king himself. This ambiguity is crucial because it reveals something important about how Chinese historiography has often treated women who appear at moments of dynastic crisis not as fully realized human beings with complex motivations, but as symbols, explanations, and warnings. The Zhou dynasty, which overthrew the Shang in the Great Battle of Muye around 1046 BCE, had every incentive to portray Dixin as irredeemably evil and to cast Daji as the malevolent force behind the throne. The victors write history, and the Zhou needed to justify their rebellion against their overlords as righteous, heaven-sanctioned action. The concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that heaven grants legitimacy to virtuous rulers and withdraws it from tyrants, was developed in large part to explain and legitimize exactly this kind of dynastic transition. Daji, as the embodiment of the corrupting influence that had caused heaven to withdraw its mandate from the Shang, served a precise ideological function. She was not merely a historical figure, she was a theological argument. The early historical texts that mention her are few and often contradictory. The Shijing contains oblique references to the ruin of the Shang. The Shujing preserves speeches attributed to the Zhou founders that justify their rebellion in terms of Dixin's moral failure. Neither source devotes much attention to Daji herself. She is peripheral to the historical narrative, mentioned primarily as evidence of the king's moral degradation. The elaborate mythological apparatus that would eventually grow up around her, the fox spirit, the divine mandate, the catalogue of cruelties, all of this belongs to a much later layer of tradition, one that began accumulating perhaps in the Zhou period, but reached its fullest expression only in the literature of the Ming Dynasty, 2.5 millennia after the events it purports to describe. 2. The fox spirit, mythology, enters the story. History rarely satisfies the human appetite for the supernatural, especially when the events in question are as dramatic and consequential as the fall of an ancient dynasty. And so, over the centuries following the Zhou conquest, the historical Daji was gradually subsumed into a far more elaborate mythological figure. In early Chinese texts, such as the Shanhai Jing, or Classic of Mountains and Seas, the nine-tailed fox is described as an auspicious creature, a sign of good omen, whose appearance presages a period of peace and prosperity. Some ancient texts describe it as capable of speech and as a creature whose flesh, if eaten, could ward off poison. It was associated with the Queen Mother of the West, a powerful deity, and with the magic of transformation and longevity. Over time, however, the nine-tailed fox's reputation became more complicated. As it was absorbed into the broader tradition of fox spirit lore, a tradition emphasizing the fox's capacity for deception, shape-shifting, and seduction, the creature became increasingly associated with female supernatural power of a dangerous kind. Fox spirits, in the popular imagination, were overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly seductive, and overwhelmingly threatening to male virtue and male power. They preyed on men, draining their vital energy, leading them to ruin, driving them mad with desire. The nine-tailed fox, with its ancient auspicious associations, was the most powerful and most feared of all. The fusion of Daji with this figure created something new and extraordinarily potent. It allowed storytellers to explain what might otherwise seem inexplicable. How could a man of Dixin's intelligence and strength be so utterly undone? The answer, in the mythological framework, was not merely human weakness, but supernatural compulsion. The nine-tailed fox was not just beautiful, she was magically irresistible. Dixin's failure was not simply moral weakness, but something closer to enchantment, to a cosmic trap laid by supernatural forces, far beyond any ordinary human's capacity to resist. This explanatory function was essential to the legend's cultural work. It allowed the Shang's failure to be understood as something more than ordinary political incompetence or moral corruption. By inserting a supernatural element at the heart of the catastrophe, the tradition elevated the story from history to mythology, from a tale of a bad king and his bad choices to a cosmic drama in which heaven itself was a participant. The nine-tailed fox became the vehicle through which divine will entered human history, the point where the transcendent order made contact with the mundane world and began to reshape it. But even within this mythological framework, the question of blame and agency remains richly complicated. For the legend that eventually became canonical, as told in the great 16th century novel Fengshen Yanyi, or The Investiture of the Gods, does not simply portray Daji as an autonomous agent of evil. Rather, she acts at the explicit direction of a higher power, one whose motivations are both understandable and deeply ironic. The supernatural and the political are interwoven in this telling in ways that resist simple moral summary, demanding from the reader a more complex engagement than the label evil temptress would suggest. 3. The Wrath of Nuwa, Heaven's Instrument of Destruction. In the Fengshen Yanyi, the legend begins not with Daji, but with Dixin himself, and with an act of impiety that sets the entire catastrophe in motion. The king, visiting the temple of Nuwa, the great goddess creator who fashioned humanity from clay and mended the broken sky, is seized with sudden, overwhelming desire when he sees the goddess's image enshrined within. In a fit of hubris, he writes a poem on the temple wall, expressing his wish that Nuwa were a mortal woman he could make his concubine. This act is a profound transgression. Nuwa is not merely a deity, but a primordial creative force, one of the oldest and most powerful figures in the Chinese pantheon. To lust after her image, to reduce the creator of humanity to an object of erotic fantasy, is an insult of cosmic proportions. When Nuwa returns to her temple and reads the king's poem, she is outraged, and she is also, by virtue of her divine power, entirely capable of responding. But here the legend takes a fascinating turn that distinguishes it from simpler tales of divine punishment. Nuwa does not simply strike Dixin down. Instead, she summons the spirits of 3 of the most dangerous, seductive, supernatural creatures in existence: the 1,000-year-old fox demon, the jade pipa spirit, and the 9-headed pheasant spirit. She commands them to travel to the Shang court, to infiltrate the royal household, and to use their considerable supernatural gifts to hasten the dynasty's fall, but with one critical condition. They must not harm the common people. They must act only to destroy the corrupt leadership, and they must preserve their demonic nature by never consuming human vitality in the process. This divine mandate complicates Daji's villainy in profound ways. She is terrible. Yes, the novel details her cruelties in extensive and often stomach-churning detail. But she is also, at a fundamental level, a weapon. She is heaven's instrument for enacting a judgment that has already been passed. The Shang dynasty is doomed not because Daji arrives to doom it, but because it has already forfeited heaven's favor through its own corruption. Daji merely accelerates and makes visible what is already inevitable. The theological architecture here is genuinely sophisticated. Nuwa, who created humanity, is also the agent of its partial destruction. Or rather, she channels the destructive forces that the king's impiety has called into being. The goddess's wrath is not arbitrary. It is a response to a specific moral and spiritual violation. Dixin did not simply rule badly. He insulted the cosmic order, reducing the divine to the erotic, the sacred to the profane. And the punishment fits the crime in a grimly perfect way. If the king will be destroyed by beauty and desire, then heaven will provide him with a beauty and a desire that are quite literally supernatural. This is a sophistication that often gets lost in popular retellings, which tend to reduce Daji to a straightforwardly evil temptress. The theological architecture of the Fengshen Yanyi holds Dixin responsible for his own failures, acknowledges the institutional corruption of the Shang court, and situates Daji within a framework of cosmic justice that transcends her individual malice. She is wicked, certainly. The novel makes no attempt to rehabilitate her, but her wickedness operates within a structure of divine will that uses evil to achieve righteous ends. This is a paradox that Chinese theological thought has always been willing to sit with, one that points to something essential about the tradition's understanding of how heaven operates in the world. 4. The possession, a soul displaced. The mechanics of Daji's transformation from human woman to fox demon are detailed in the Fengshen Yanyi, with a specificity that is both horrifying and, in its own way, deeply sad. The historical Su Daji, a young woman of the Su clan, described as beautiful and innocent, is traveling to the Shang court as part of a tribute arrangement between her father's fiefdom and the king. She is not a willing participant in her own fate. She is a commodity being delivered to a king she has never met, with no agency in the matter whatsoever. On the road to the capital, the fox spirit intercepts her. In the darkness of a mountain pass, the 1,000-year-old fox demon attacks the caravan, kills the real Daji's soul, and possesses her body. From this moment on, the woman who walks, breathes, and speaks in Daji's form is not Daji at all. She is the fox spirit wearing a human shell. The real Su Daji, the innocent young woman who had no part in any of this, is simply gone, displaced by a supernatural entity with an agenda entirely its own. This detail is significant for several reasons. First, it partially exonerates the historical woman from the atrocities attributed to her. She was a victim before she was a villain, dead before any of the terrible acts were committed. Second, it raises uncomfortable questions about identity and responsibility that the novel never fully resolves. If Daji's body commits crimes, but Daji's soul is absent, who bears moral responsibility? The fox? Heaven, which sent the fox. Dixin, whose lust created the opening through which supernatural evil could enter the court. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it reflects a deep cultural ambivalence about the relationship between female beauty and female evil. The idea that a beautiful woman must either be genuinely virtuous or secretly supernatural, that ordinary human women cannot simply be both attractive and wicked, runs through much of classical Chinese literature. By making Daji a demon in human form, the legend sidesteps the troubling possibility that she might have been a real woman making real choices, or that her influence over the king might reflect something about Dixin's own psychology rather than external supernatural compulsion. Once installed in the palace, the fox-possessed Daji embarks on a campaign of escalating horror that the Fengshen Yanyi describes in considerable detail. She becomes Dixin's favorite, displacing the queen and the other consorts. She whispers suggestions in the king's ear, each one darker than the last. She devises entertainments that are in fact instruments of torture. And she directs her supernatural cunning toward eliminating every voice at court that might counsel moderation or rebellion. The palace, which should have been the center of ordered governance, becomes instead a theater of cruelty, its rituals of propriety hollowed out and replaced by spectacles of suffering staged for the fox demon's pleasure and the king's increasing moral blindness. 5. The Cruelties, a catalog of horror. The specific atrocities attributed to Daji in the Fengshen Yanyi and related texts form one of the most disturbing catalogs of violence in classical Chinese literature. Some of these cruelties have become so famous that they are known even to people who have never read the novel, embedded in the broader cultural consciousness through millennia of storytelling, opera, and popular tradition. The most iconic is perhaps the Paoluo, the bronze column of fire. In this torture, a bronze column was heated to red heat over a bed of coals, and condemned prisoners were forced to walk across it. They would inevitably fall and be burned alive as Dixin and Daji watched from above, enjoying what the text describes as Daji's particular delight in the spectacle of suffering. The legend holds that Daji laughed when prisoners fell, or rather, that the fox spirit within her was gratified by the display of human pain, revealing through these moments the non-human nature beneath the beautiful exterior. There is also the legend of Begone, one of the most tragic figures in the entire narrative. Begone was Dixin's own uncle, a man of legendary moral courage and wisdom who repeatedly remonstrated with the king about his excesses. Daji, recognizing in Begone one of the few remaining forces at court capable of challenging the dynasty's slide into ruin, devised a way to eliminate him that also served as a grotesque test of a legend she had heard, that a loyal minister's heart has 7 orifices. She convinced Dixin that she was ill and that only the heart of a truly loyal minister, prepared as medicine, could cure her. Dixin, besotted, ordered Begone to cut out his own heart. In one of the most famous exchanges in Chinese literary history, Begone reportedly asked how a man could live without his heart. Daji's reply was that a truly sage man could. He did as commanded and died, and with him died one of the last voices of conscience at the Shang court. The legend also describes an incident involving the legitimate queen, Jiang Hufei, whom Daji viewed as a rival and an obstacle. Through a series of machinations, Daji convinced Dixin that the queen had behaved treacherously,